Welcome back to the Nursing Post podcast, All Nursing All the Time with Ashley and Rosa. In this episode, we continue our discussion of Henrietta Lacks, her contribution to science, its medical and ethical implications. Our goal is always to inform and start conversation.
So picking up right where we left off on our last episode, Dr. Gaze discovered that the Henrietta's cancer cells did something that no one else had done, that they replicated, doubling about every 24 hours indefinitely. See, normal cells generally die after about 50 divisions. And Dr. Gay had tried to grow cells in cultures numerous times, but was never successful in doing that. So remember, Henrietta was 30 years old at the time of her diagnosis of her cervical cancer. So a little bit of statistics, just to kind of pull all this together a little bit. And this is from the American Cancer Society on cervical cancer. And this is for the United States in 2021. Cervical precancerous cells are diagnosed far more often than invasive cervical cancer. Cervical cancer was one of the most common cause of cancer death for American women. Cervical cancer is most frequently diagnosed in women between the ages of 35 and 44. More than 20% of cases of cervical cancer are found in women over 65. About 14,480 new cases of invasive cervical cancer will be diagnosed, and about 4,290 women will die from cervical cancer. So this is a pretty significant and severe disease.
It is, but the thing, like we've mentioned in previous podcast episodes, is that once it's detected early, it's treatable.
Yes.
It's a very treatable cancer. Henrietta's cervical cancer, it was so aggressive, so much so that she died a year after diagnosis when she was only 31. And she died in the color ward of a hospital, and she was buried in an unmarked grave. As mentioned in the last episode, Henrietta did die, but she lives on today. The reason her cells were so remarkable was because the HeLa cells would become the most widely used cell line in biological research. The cell line is named after her first two initials of her first and last name. Her cell line has had significant implications on science. There are now billions and billions of HeLa cells in laboratories all over the world.
So in 1952, we were working on eradicating polio. The need for massive amounts of cells for evaluation of the polio vaccine would forever intertwine with the history of polio vaccines and HeLa cells. A team of researchers and staff at Tuskegee University helped the mass production of the HeLa cells for use nationally in development of the polio vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And the mass accumulating nature of the HeLa cells and the integral ability to be easily infected by the polio virus made it an ideal alternative to rhesus monkey cells. The NFIP, or the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, proposed the establishment of a central source in order to supply HeLa cultures to meet the anticipated needs of researchers testing the vaccine. That is amazing.
It's huge. And like, until I sat down and, we did this research, I had no idea. Like, literally when I read that she's dead, but she's still living, it's because it's true. Not only did she help in eradicating polio, in 1955, her cells are being used to clone. HeLa cells were the first human cells to be successfully cloned. They were first cultured and then cloned, meaning multiplied as identical cells.
Mm-hmm.
Then in 1960, they were the first cells to literally go into space in zero gravity, and they survived. Then in 1981, basically you can consider her the mother of all cells, because without the HeLa cells, we wouldn't have what's known today as in vitro fertilization. So she has brought over 5 million lives into the world just using her cells.
And not only that, in 1986, she helped creating pretty much the field of virology for HIV. The T cell sport a surface protein called a CD4, which is what HIV uses to enter a cell. When the CD4 was added to HeLa cells, they could be infected with HIV, allowing HIV drugs to be tested on HeLa cells. Not only that, TB, herpes, Zika, measles, mumps, all vaccines and medications stemming from the use of HeLa cells. In 2006, vaccinating girls against cancer, the HPV vaccination, again, from those HeLa cells.
And then, of course, they used her cell line in 2013 to help map the human genome. And her cells are currently being researched for, lack of a better word, a fountain of youth.
So,
because think about it, it makes sense. These are cells that never die. They keep replicating.
mm-hmm.
So we've come this far since 1952 to currently, possibly having the fountain of youth on our hands.
It's amazing to me. Like, could you imagine having a conversation with her now saying, because they took these cells, against your will, or maybe not, maybe she would have been okay with it. You don't know. We didn't ask because we just did it.
Yeah.
Which is a whole issue in itself. But think about what we would not know, or what we would not be able to do, or how our world would look without the progress made by these cells in medicine.
It would definitely be very different than what it is today. Obviously, we would have never had the polio vaccine. Obviously, we wouldn't have all these medications for all these viruses that her cells are currently being used to make treatments and medications from. But even with all of her, life-saving cells, there are ramifications for it, then and now.
Yes.
There's legal, there's moral, there's ethical. It's the flip side of it. Yes, she did all these things to help, cure people, but it wasn't on the up and up.
No.
So back in 1951, she did sign the usual consent forms for treating her cancer, but those consent forms never said anything or asked permission to remove anything, not tissue samples, not tumors, none of that was done, because in 1951, it just wasn't common practice. It was implied, I guess. But today we know that every patient has to have informed consent, and they have to sign off for everything, from the surgery, the anesthesia, to whatever's being removed from their bodies, to, permission for it to be sent off to pathology and tested. Mm-hmm. All these things are normal now.
Yes.
And it's funny and it's sad. However, the only reason we know today whose cells these belong to are because the scientist wasn't clever enough to really conceal the fact that it came from Henrietta Lacks. If we're being true and honest about it, he was not very clever. He used the first 2 letters of her first name and the first 2 letters of her last name. So now everybody knows who she is and where these cells originated from. Well, courts have sided with researchers so far. There's a case in 1980, Moore versus Regents of the University of California. There was a leukemia patient that the doctor had discovered his cell line, did something in particular that no one else's cell line did. And he took this patient's cells and basically sold the cell line and got $3 billion for it. The Supreme Court actually ruled that Moore had no rights to share in any of the profits that this doctor received, $3 billion, even though these cell lines belonged to that patient. So it may be legal, but is it ethical?
With Henrietta's experience, Dr. Gay nor Hopkins made any financial gains in 1951 as they were giving these cell lines away for free. But in 1954, someone was and would sell them to researchers and pharmaceutical companies. As her cells became commercialized, researchers can buy a vial of them for $250. Her family has lived without education, healthcare, and in poverty, despite all the money that
Big Pharma has made off of her cell line.
exactly. And 60,000 medical journal articles have been published about their use, and at least 11,000 patents are related to HeLa use. And there are thousands of other cell lines, but the HeLa remains the most popular because it's easy to grow, store, and ship. Isn't that 2021?
It sure is. I completely understand that medicine has changed drastically in the last 70 years. We've had so many advances and, ethical advances too. Like, we know what informed consent is. We have to get that each and every single time. But even with that being said, I know I feel a certain type of way, because if it's my body, it should be my choice. And with that being said, whomever is taking my cells and is using, and they're being used unknowingly in medical research and in medical advancements and treatments, why can't I be compensated for that? This is one of the reasons why we don't name cell lines anymore with the first two initials of the first person's first and last name. But I feel like if I have to consent to donate my blood or my organs or to even have surgeries, why wouldn't I be given the opportunity to consent to scientific research, or even have the opportunity to say, no, when you're done with those, I want you to destroy them. I don't want them to be used. And why shouldn't I or my family be compensated? And most importantly, why shouldn't the Lax family be compensated?
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, that's, it's kind of sad because in medicine, we have a trend for this. I mean, even now, it's just now getting to the point where some universities are saying that they're not doing it anymore. But you have a female that is under GYN surgery. They'll have 4 and 5 residents come in and perform pelvic exams while the patient is unconscious. So that way they can practice their pelvic exams. And they do this without that person's consent or knowledge.
It's just crazy to me.
And they're still doing that today.
It's crazy to me. It's crazy to me. But what I would love to do is put a pin in this and come back to it, because the Lax family currently has a case pending on the court dockets against pharmaceutical companies because they're wanting to be compensated. They've gone 70 years impoverished, while the rest of America and Big Pharma has had, the ability to be cured and or to
they have
sell
all
the cure
monetized off of it.
Off of her, and her family has had none of that. So I'm interested, even though this case in 1980 was found in favor of the researcher, I'm curious to see how this court case is going to pan out, just because of the magnitude of the medical advances that it's given to, the world.
Oh, absolutely. So we know that medicine has changed dramatically, but we would love to hear your thoughts and opinions if families should be compensated, and if should that be a portion of whatever is made off of the cells? Is it a one-time fee? Or do you think that without consent to obtain cells, that no researcher should be obtaining cells for research purposes and or profit? Because ultimately that's where it's going to end up.
It
I don't mean
always,
that to be facetious, but
no.
it really,
It
you
all
can go
boils
into
down
it
to
with
the dollars and the cents.
yeah, you can go into it with a good heart, but then once people start coming at you with money, it just blurs things. So we would really like to hear your opinion and your thoughts on this topic, not only with the Henrietta Lacks case, but just in general. Check out our website for our references, thenursingpostpodcast.com, and you can subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And thanks again for listening to The Nursing Post.